So this is pretty interesting because you know how my brother mentioned holiness today? It's about holiness. Okay, the class is about holiness. So it's pretty, and I mean, it's the book. So awesome. Chapters 7 and 8, the Bible's ubiquitous weirdness, or I prefer the subtitle, Kosher Foods, Kooky Laws. Okay. So we know that when God takes his people out of Egypt, he enters into a covenant with them, which we call the Mosaic Law. The contents, right, we can find starting from Exodus 20, I am the Lord your God, the 10 Commandments, right, all the way to Numbers 10. And then when we look at Deuteronomy, if you've ever read Deuteronomy, you're like, wow, this seems very familiar to what I just read in Exodus 20 to Numbers. And it's because it's a restatement of what you read. It's called the second law. And you have to remember that the people, the Israelites who made the covenant with God at Mount Sinai, that generation died off. So what's happening is Moses is about to, die off as well. And he's getting them ready to enter the promised land. So they enter into that covenant with God again. And this is God telling them, Moses telling them, hey, you're going to enter the promised land, but this is how I want you to live. Okay, this is how you ought to govern yourselves. And right, we can readily acknowledge the validity and endurance of many of these laws. For example, we still believe that murder is wrong, that it's wrong to commit adultery, to steal, to lie, to perform child sacrifices, okay? For the Christian, the two greatest commandments are taken from the law, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, right? And love people, your neighbor, as yourself. Insofar as these laws are repeated in the new covenant, they are binding on us, okay? On the other hand, we have to be frank, and admit that some of these laws, at least to our ears, are outright weird. Hence the subtitle, Kooky Laws, right? I'm thinking here of, you shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seeds, nor shall you wear a garment made out of two different kinds of material. Good thing I'm wearing cotton today. Okay? Don't boil a goat in its mother's milk. You shall not eat any flesh with the blood in it. And then all the other food laws, which we're going to discuss today. How about the prohibition on tattoos and ruining the corners of your beard? Okay. As we established last class, these laws were only binding on citizens of ancient Israel. Okay. For this covenant has now been made obsolete by a new superior covenant mediated by Jesus. As Copan says, Israel's Old Testament covenant wasn't a universal ideal, and it was never intended to be so. Moreover, we shouldn't think of the Old Covenant as rule keeping in order to secure salvation. Similar, right, to how in the New Testament, what pattern do we see? We see you're saved by grace, through faith, for good works. The Old Covenant actually exemplifies this as well. This is what one scholar has called the grace gratitude ideal. This is what God has done for you. Therefore, out of gratitude, you need to do this. You should do this for others, okay? God's gracious act of deliverance is what sets the stage for the Mosaic Law, right? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Or in Leviticus 11:45. For I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. Indeed, this is the underlying rationale for all of the kooky laws that we read about, and it's the main theme in the book of Leviticus, holiness, okay? Not only were the Israelites getting ready to enter the promised land, but God was going to dwell with the Israelites, okay? God's habitation was going to be the tabernacle. So the Israelites needed to be holy because, as C.S. Lewis so beautifully put it, in other words, God is good, but he's not safe, okay? So good exegesis would have us interpret all of these kooky laws through the lens of holiness. Okay? Specifically, holiness in two areas. So we can view the laws in Leviticus as separation laws. Israel has to work, it has to rest, worship, eat, and even clothe themselves differently from their pagan neighbors, thereby asserting their distinctive identity as God's people. I'm not making this up. Leviticus 20, 22 through 26. Keep all my decrees and laws and follow them, so that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. You must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive out before you. Because they did all these things, I abhorred them. But I said to you, you will possess their land. I will give it to you as an inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has set you apart from the nations. You must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals, and between clean and unclean birds. Do not defile yourselves by any animal or bird or anything that moves along the ground, those that I have set apart as unclean for you. You are to be holy to me, because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. Right? This is pretty crystal clear. Just as God is set apart from humans, Israel was to be set apart in its behavior and its theology from the surrounding nations. But ultimately, the separation wasn't just about rituals, okay? What I mean here is that holiness wasn't simply a matter of abstaining. It was also a matter of wholeheartedly pursuing God's heart. I mean, look at the Pharisees. Okay, this is exactly what had happened to them. Jesus says, woe to you, Pharisees, right? And Jesus castigates the Pharisees because they were focusing on the ceremonial laws, the external things, without focusing on the heart, what those things were supposed to symbolize. Okay, Jesus says, you worry about cleaning the outside of the cup, but inside you're full of filth. First clean the inside of the cup, then the outside will be clean. And I mean, they should have known better. In Psalm 51, it was at least clear to David that God does not delight in burnt offering, that he doesn't take pleasure in sacrifice. What does God want? David tells us, a humble and contrite heart. God, through the prophet Isaiah, says the same thing. He says that your sacrifices, when he's speaking to the Israelites, are detestable to me. He says, if I remember correctly, the one who offers a bull like the one who murders a man. Why? Because they were doing all these sacrifices for God, but they were living evil lives. Okay, and the whole point, the whole point of the sacrifices was to say, God, I sinned, and the fate of this animal that I'm killing should be my fate because I sinned. Okay, but then they were sacrificing the animals and then living however they wanted. Okay, so Copan says, holiness wasn't a religious pretense. When God prescribed rituals, he wanted them to represent humility of heart and love for God and neighbor. So to understand these laws in Leviticus mainly, we need to think through the lens of holiness, okay? And we also, Copan says, we need the interpretive key of symbolism. The other day, as I was taking out the trash, I hadn't noticed that my dad had lowered the flag to be at half-mast because of Charlie, okay, which is when something distressful happens, if you have a flag, you know how it's usually all the way high? Well, you put it half-mast, okay. And that led me to then, right, to think about this instance in my life where for some reason here at church, we were carrying some flags, and we had to do an event with flags. There was the Christian flag and other flags, and then there was the American flag. And I remember I was little, and I was carrying the American flag, and I was letting it drag on the ground. Okay, and a brother came, an older person came, and basically told me, "What are you doing? You're letting the flag drag. That's disrespectful. This and that." And in a sense, my Cuban way of thinking as a man, and also in my childish way of thinking, I was like, what's this dude's problem? It ain't that serious, right? But actually, he wasn't being ridiculous, okay? Because flags stand for, they symbolize the country. And that's why you treat them with respect. I mean, when people hate the country, what do? They burn the flag because it has meaning. They're saying, I hate this country, okay? How about in our everyday lives, okay? Let me give you a lively example. The middle finger is just a finger, right? It's just a couple of inches that extend from a person's hand. But we know that just a piece of meat can turn into an insult, right? When the right circumstances come in play, when someone cuts you off or something on the road, and you happen to lower the other finger, and leave the middle finger out in the air, it's no longer a piece of flesh that's just three. It becomes an insult, okay? How about money? Oh, money's physically, like, just accurate description, money is a piece of paper about this big, right? And I can give you the dimensions and all of these things. But heck, if you give me some of those pieces of paper, I'll take them, right? Why? Because they symbolize wealth, okay? So Copan tells us, why, have you asked yourself, why do many Levitical laws emphasize semen and blood? Leviticus 15 speaks of the emission of semen and the discharging of menstrual blood, both of which led to impurity and the need for washing or purification. So what's going on here? Because sex within marriage isn't sinful. God isn't prudish about sex. I mean, have you read Song of Solomon? Have you heard one of the first commandments God gives humans? Go, right, and multiply, be fruitful. Women aren't being punished by virtue of being women, okay, and having a menstrual cycle. What's going on here? Well, scholars suggest that cleanness and uncleanness are symbolic of life and death, respectively, okay? And so what's happening here is a clashing of symbols. Vaginal blood and semen are powerful symbols of life, but their loss symbolizes death. For example, consider the prohibition on cooking a baby goat, in its mother's milk. What's the problem? Isn't it more yummy? I don't know. Life, the mother's milk, and death, cooking a baby goat, are colliding in this scenario. Likewise, another clash is in Leviticus 22:28. Do not slaughter a cow or sheep and its young on the same day. Okay? You have death, and then you have a baby, right? Life on the same day. So then, when we read about this language in Leviticus, the language of cleanness and uncleanness, or purity and impurity, don't do the following. Don't interpret these as referring to health or hygiene. Okay? This just isn't the case. Neither should we conflate ceremonial impurity with moral impurity. Someone being unclean, for example, a woman, because of her menstrual cycle, did not mean that she was sinful. Okay? To put it another way, ceremonial uncleanness wasn't necessarily a marker of a person's personal holiness before God. Okay? To give you guys more examples, some animals we know are called unclean, but in Genesis, God calls them good. Okay? They're part of God's good creation. Priests with a defect, they were limited in what they were able to do in the sanctuary, but this doesn't mean that having a physical defect is sinful or wrong, right? And as we already mentioned, sex is a good gift from God, right? And is not sinful within marriage. But the emission of semen would cause people to not be clean, to need purification. So I guess another way we can think about this, there are these things called sets and subsets. And they're actually very useful for thinking, for making distinctions. So basically what I've been saying can be represented by this. So you have a big set. Let's say you have holiness, okay? And within holiness, for the Israelites, you had moral purity. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, right? And then we had ceremonial purity, okay? Which is the food laws, the having to be purified after the emission of semen or a menstrual cycle, okay? Moral purity, right, isn't the same as ceremonial impurity like I was just talking about. But you see how this is like a Venn diagram? Because in the Old Testament, well, for one reason, because the Israelites were commanded to observe these ceremonial laws, if they didn't do it, they were in disobedience to God. So you see how they're different, but not completely separate. And also, the Old Testament uses very interesting terminology. So, for example, we know that murder would be a moral impurity or an abomination. But murder is also described as polluting the land. See, it's talking about ceremonial. So they're different. They're part of holiness, but they can also coincide. What do I want you guys to understand? At least for me, it was very helpful the day when I read these laws and I discovered that cleanness and uncleanness isn't necessarily talking about sin. I was like, oh, wow, that makes a lot more sense, because I was like, wow, if you see some of these things, these are like just diseases that people can't help. So you're like, wow, God is saying, you're sinful because you're defective, you have a disease. No, okay, right? It's a matter of ceremonial purity, okay? And the point is, Copan is telling us this, the ceremonies are supposed to symbolize holiness. That's what's behind all of these things, okay? Let's move on to what I call the final boss of Levitical laws, okay? And these are the kosher, or the dietary laws. So let's go ahead and open our Bibles to Leviticus 11. And I'm going to be reading in the NIV. Okay. Some of these animals, I don't even know what they are, okay? Science is not my strong suit. Anyways, it says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, okay, of all the Israelites that live on land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and that chews the cud. These are some that only chew the cud or only have a divided hoof, but you must not eat them. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is ceremonially unclean for you. The hyrax, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is unclean for you. The rabbit, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is unclean for you. And the pig, though it has a divided hoof, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you. Let's stop right here. We're going to continue. What do we have here? We have the category of land animals, correct? Were you guys able to catch that? Land. Okay. And what made a land animal unclean? You guys can help me out. Okay, so to be clean, what did an animal need to do? What characteristics? You say it louder with confidence. You can be confidently wrong, it's okay. Or just read the verse. It says it. Divided hoof. So, one divided hoof. Two, cud chewer. So, sometimes it's presented as three, like characteristics that it needed, and sometimes it's presented as two. The point is, camel, Okay, I'm going to use the example of camel because I think we're all familiar. There's such thing. We know what a camel toe looks like. Okay? Like, oh, I'm such a bad. Right? That's close enough. Okay. You see how it's cloven-footed. Okay, cloven-footed means that it's divided in two. But you guys aren't going to be able to concentrate now. Great. But it needs to have a completely divided hoof. Okay? It needs to be completely down the middle. So the camel, although it has a cloven foot and it's a cud chewer, because it's not completely split in half, then it's unclean. And then some animals, vice versa. Some animals have a split hoof completely, but because they don't chew the cud. Okay, you guys get it? That's the first. Let's move on to the next. And let me just, so you guys can concentrate. There you go. All right. Verse 9. Of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams, you may not eat any that have fins and scales. But all creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to regard as unclean. And since you are to regard them as unclean, you must not eat their meat. You must regard their carcasses as unclean. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be regarded as unclean by you. This one's a little easier, right? To be clean, we have another category. And what's that category? Water. I mean, just see, because I mean that would include the ocean as well. I'm just being obnoxious. So we have water. And can you guys help me out to be clean? Fins and scales. Okay, fins. Pretty easy. Anything that doesn't have both of these, unclean. Okay? Verse 13. These are the birds you are to regard as unclean and not eat because they are unclean: the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, any kind of black kite, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hopi, and the bat. All flying insects that walk on all fours are to be regarded as unclean by you. There are, however, some flying insects that walk on all fours that you may eat, those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. Of these you may eat any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, or grasshopper, but all other flying insects that have 4 legs you are to regard unclean. What's the next category? Air. Let's call it air. Okay. No, these are not the elements. Shut up. Air. Okay. Help me out here. I'll help you guys out. Big old question mark. Okay. I answered it. No, okay. We're going to discuss this later, because how you view this has to do with other things, and we're going to discuss that. So we'll put an asterisk. We'll put a note on this. For now, though, what's pretty clear? What's clear is that if it's an insect, okay, the only ones that have wings, that are insect, that also have legs, are the ones that are jointed, right? That have 4 legs, but they're in pairs of 2, which means they can fly around, but then when they're on land, they basically hop around because it's jointed like a grasshopper. Okay, so let me just write here 2 pairs of jointed legs. And this is for insects. Okay? Enough of writing. Now, of course, what are we going to do? All we've seen basically is all we've done is categorize them and say, okay, it says this is unclean because of this. But of course, we still need a rationale. Hopefully, we can find the rationale. Why are these characteristics representative of uncleanness or cleanness? Okay. And Copan is basically going to offer us several suggestions. The first 2, he thinks they are unsatisfactory. And then the last one, of course, is the satisfactory one. Okay. The first angle or suggestion is to look at these. The reason why these are clean and unclean is because they were deemed unclean because they were a potential danger to health. Okay. The first approach is one of health, of hygiene. Israelites were to avoid, for example, vultures because they eat roadkill and carnivores' leftovers, and who knows what kinds of diseases they carry. We know that pigs can transmit diseases, while the hare and rock badger commonly also carry diseases. Shrimp, don't eat shrimp because that raises your cholesterol. Moreover, some other laws are clearly, at least in part, motivated by a concern for hygiene or for public health. For example, when the Israelites were to encamp against an enemy, God told them, hey, if you need to relieve yourselves, you have to leave the camp, you have to dig a hole, and then your excrement goes in the hole, and then you cover up the excrement. Whatever else we may say, obviously, at least secondarily, hygiene had to do with that. Okay? The same goes for laws about leprosy or skin diseases. The pragmatic motivation, at least it seems to me, behind them was to stop the spread of contagious skin diseases, especially because the Israelites were living in such a close-knit community where it could spread so easily. Therefore, having established that health or hygiene is at least a partial motivation for other laws, and having cited the potential danger to health of some of the animals deemed unclean, we can conclude that a plausible explanation of the motivation behind the food laws is health or hygiene. That's the first argument, okay? Copan says, this has a couple of problems. This is unconvincing because it's just not clear that all the unclean animals are harmful to health. Okay? Second, he says there are motive clauses when you read Leviticus and then when you read the restatement in Deuteronomy 14. When you read why it mentions that they shouldn't eat these animals, the only thing you're going to find are because you shouldn't eat them because of the way they travel or their eating habits. And then at the end of the day, he says, because I am holy and you are to be holy, right? So it seems like it's more a matter of holiness, like we already said at the beginning, than of health. Finally, Copan says this explanation is unsatisfactory because why then did Jesus declare all foods clean if health was really the underlying factor in the kosher laws? Crying face. Jesus no longer cares about our health. Okay. Now there's another approach, and this one is of religious association. So just think, you know how some people, if you've read the 10 plagues and you've ever asked yourself, why these 10 plagues? Some people say that it's because they represented or had to do with the Egyptian culture and their gods. So by God using these plagues, he was showing the Egyptians that he was more powerful than their gods. I don't know if that's true or if it's not. It's just so you guys get an illustration, because this explanation is basically that, but applied to the kosher laws. Basically, unclean animals were associated with non-Israelite religion in the ancient Near East. God, of course, wouldn't want them to be associated with things, with paganism, with idolatry. So he said, those are unclean. For instance, we know that the Hittites sacrificed pigs. Well, that's why God said they're unclean, according to this view, right? Other animals declared unclean were worshipped by the Egyptians. Therefore, as God's holy people, it makes sense for these animals to be declared unclean in order to distance the Israelites, right, from these pagan idolatrous practices. This is a pretty straightforward explanation. What's the problem? Well, Copan says, if that's the case, then the bull should have been considered an abomination, because this animal was the central animal in Canaanite and Egyptian religion. But as it turns out, the bull is actually one of, or the most prized animal in Israelite worship. Okay? So it doesn't really make sense for this to be the motivation then. I guess what Copan is trying to say here, you know how lately everyone's Hitler. What I mean by this is, and there's a particular political party that likes to call everyone else Hitler. We all know which party it is. But, this guy did this. Hitler also did this. He's Hitler, okay? Hitler drank water. This guy drinks water as well. Hitler had a mustache. This guy has a mustache. Hitler spoke German. This guy speaks German. You see how, we see this in the news media all the time. It's so comical. It would be comical if a lot of people didn't believe it. Comparisons, the point of comparisons is to compare like to like in the aspects that matter. Okay? If you want to establish that someone is Hitler, well, you have to look at the authoritarian, the evil things that Hitler actually did, and establish how that person is showing like exactly the same. But just because we have shared characteristics with something doesn't make it a good comparison. Or to put it differently, a lot of times in arguments, people will give comparisons. And then, of course, and they're good comparisons because they are similar in the area that they need to be similar. In order to make a good comparison, the comparisons don't need to be exactly the same. Only in the area that matters that you're making the comparison. But people will say, oh no, let me give you guys a real world example. Slavery, okay, and abortion. Some people will say abortion is justified because, well, it's not really a human being inside. And so then people who are against abortion will say, you know what other time in history we said a group of entities weren't persons? Slavery, okay? You don't just get to define subjectively when life begins or what makes a person. The same thing happened with the Nazis. Oh, the Jews, they're just not persons. It's very easy to kill someone, right, if it's not a person. So then the people who are against abortion say, just the same way as it was wrong for them to consider these people as subhuman, it is wrong for you to just subjectively, arbitrarily decide that the fetus isn't a human because it actually goes against science, etc., etc. Okay? Just so you guys get, whether you agree with me or not, I'm not trying to make an argument here. Okay, I'm just trying to give an illustration. Now we enter into the explanation that Copan thinks is a decent one, or at least explains most of the distinctions. And that's that the animals symbolized what God wanted from his people. More specifically, Copan borrows from the British anthropologist Mary Douglas, who argued that there is a connection between the kinds of animals that are permitted or forbidden and the kind of people God wants Israel to be. He says there are two angles, two approaches to this. The first one is the angle of creation. Genesis 1, if you look when God is creating, he divides animals into three spheres. Guess what spheres? Wow, land, water, air, okay? Leviticus 11 lists as unclean animals certain animals that are connected to land, water, and air. In other words, these animals symbolize a mixing or blurring of the categories. You could say that the animals, quote unquote, transgressed boundaries or overlapped spheres, and so they were avoided because they were unclean. So, water. To be clean, what do they need? Scales and fins. So eels or shellfish, which don't fit this category, are unclean and thus prohibited. Land animals, the ones that are clean, are the ones that are four-footed, that hop, walk, or jump. This is the fact that they have a split hoof and chew the cud is a clear indication, okay, that they belong to land. Whereas camels, hares, pigs, etc. are borderline cases because they only meet one of the conditions, so they should be avoided. How about air? Okay, birds have two wings for flying. We all know that. Okay, birds like the pelicans and gulls inhabit both water and sky. So guess what? They're unclean because they blur the distinctions. Insects that fly but have many legs are unclean. Guess why? Because they operate in two spheres as well, land and air. Okay, but what about the locust, the cricket, and the grasshopper? Okay, the fact that they have jointed feet, okay, and wings makes them very similar to birds, right, which hop on the ground with two legs. So there is no transgressing the boundaries. What's the symbolic application? Because remember, this is supposed to symbolize something. So we just gave the symbol, but what's the application? Parents will tell their kids to not get mixed up with the wrong crowd. Okay? The Bible says bad company corrupts good morals. In the same page, unclean animals symbolize that Israel was to avoid mixing in with the beliefs and practices of the surrounding nations. Like clean animals, God's chosen people were to be distinct from the surrounding nations, and even their diet served as a reminder of this. Because of their diet, not only would the Israelites find it difficult to eat with the idolatrous people around them, but also their diet. But through their diet, God was reminding Israel of her own distinctive holy calling. Any questions right here about this one? The birds. Well, it kind of gave an explanation, but yes, you see, the thing with these that we need to keep in mind is that, at least personally, none of these in and of themselves or by themselves completely explain everything. What we're looking for is the best explanation, the explanatory power, what makes the best sense of the data. And if you look at life, a lot of our beliefs have to be like that. If you're looking for something that explains everything, you're gonna always look in life and you're not gonna find it, okay? So you have to embrace uncertainty at some level. But to go off what Gabby's saying, this is why that's only angle, creation is only angle 1, and he complements it with angle number 2, death and abnormality. Animals that are unclean appear to be either predatory animals or 2, vulnerable animals. And by vulnerable, we mean here defective in appearance or characteristics. So vulnerable to the human eye. Clean versus unclean. Animals of the air, such as owls, gulls, hawks, vultures, etc., are forbidden in Israel's diet because they are predatory. Okay? Some animals are and then in the same vein, some animals are unclean not because they represent predation, but because they represent victims of predation. For instance, the aquatic animals symbolically, right, the ones without fins and scales, symbolically lack something they need, and so they function as a picture of vulnerability. As for the land animals, those that chew the cud and have split hooves are plant eaters, clearly, so they never eat any blood and are thus not predatory. What's the symbolism behind this? Well, as you'll recall, one of the laws in Leviticus, I believe it is that eating blood is prohibited because, quote, the life of all flesh is in its blood. And I mean, this goes back to Genesis. After the flood, God tells Noah and his descendants that they are prohibited from consuming blood because blood is supposed to represent like a respect for life. Okay. The symbolism here is that the eating of blood represents predatory activity and a disregard for life. Coupled with the prohibition on seemingly vulnerable animals, the lesson was that Israel's relationships were to be characterized by justice, by love for the neighbor, not the unholy activity of preying upon the vulnerable. So we have the symbolism and the application. But we're not done yet, okay? Because anyone can cook up a story. I'm so surprised to find out how if you have a great imagination, most people will believe what you tell them, even if it's crazy, even if it has nothing to do with the evidence or reality. If you're persuasive and you can cook up a story, people will believe it. I mean, I've really seen this with the Charlie Kirk stuff. Okay, people with some great imagination start saying about the motivation and how the conspiracy behind, right, the assassination, and people will believe it because I mean, these people are very creative. They'll make like whole novels, and you're like, wow, and you get lost in the story, and then you forget to take a step back and just ask yourself the simple question: where's the evidence for this? Why should I believe this to be true? Okay, don't get put to sleep by stories, guys. A lot of people out there will be like, I can explain that. And then they'll tell you a story but never offer any evidence. So let's look, okay? If we can see, let me put it differently, okay? We are saying that this is the symbolism, or at least Copan is arguing this. But is the symbolism effective if the Israelites don't appreciate the symbolism? No, right? What's the whole point? If God is using these laws to get the Israelites to be holy via the symbolism, but the Israelites don't get the symbolism, you're being a clown, right? Okay? Let's look at Scripture. And actually, if we look at the Old Testament, it makes this plausible because several Old Testament texts establish a close connection between man and animals. For example, both the firstborn among men and animals had to be redeemed. One of the 10 commandments is that domesticated animals have to observe the Sabbath, just like the owners. Copan also notes the striking parallel language between the unblemished priest in Leviticus 21 and that of the unblemished sacrificial animal in Leviticus 22. Namely, neither the priest nor the animal sacrificed to God could have a bruised, broken, or fractured limb, couldn't be blind, couldn't have eczema or scabs. Literally, that's parallel language, word for word. In short, both had to be without defect or blemish. What these texts do, and there are others, but for lack of time, is give credence to the claim that animals symbolize what God wanted from his people. Allow me to quote Gordon Wenham at length. These examples appear to substantiate Douglas's contention that this symbolism was consciously felt in ancient Israel, that there was a system underlined the uncleanness regulations. They expressed an understanding of holiness and of Israel's special status as the holy people of God. The division into clean foods and unclean foods corresponded to the division between holy Israel and the Gentile world. Among those animals that were clean, there were a few types that could be offered in sacrifice. Similarly, there was a group of men within Israel who could offer sacrifice: the priests. Through this system of symbolic laws, Israelites were reminded at every meal of their redemption to be God's people. Their diet was limited to certain meats in imitation of their God, who had restricted his choice among the nations to Israel. It served too to bring to mind Israel's responsibilities to be a holy nation. As they distinguished between clean and unclean foods, they were reminded that holiness was more than a matter of meat and drink, but a way of life characterized by purity and integrity. Now you know why I had to quote it at length. I couldn't have said it better myself. A lot of people will get tripped up. So this guy just mentioned, right, Israel as God's holy people, as God's chosen people. So a lot of people at this point will get a little tripped up at the notion of God having a chosen people. But if we've learned, I think, anything from these laws, is that yes, being God's chosen people was definitely a privilege. Imagine living under God's laws. We know that brings prosperity. And here I'm obviously not just referring to material. It's just you're living in accordance with reality. It's a good idea to live in accordance with the reality. Okay? It's both a privilege and a responsibility. So Viktor Frankl, who's a philosopher, psychologist, in his book, I think it was in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he says that, right, you know how we have a Statue of Liberty on the East Coast? Because he stresses the importance of being responsible and using freedom properly. He said Americans, to supplement, should have a statue of responsibility on the West Coast. Okay? Likewise, there's from this play, The Fiddler. Okay, and he says, I know, this is a Jew. Okay, the Fiddler on the Roof is about a Jew. He says, I know, we are your chosen people, but once in a while, can't you choose someone else? Okay, I'm sure the Israelites I felt like that in my life. I'm like, God, can't you choose someone else? Okay, right? The fact that there's some sort of blind favoritism or immorality in God choosing the Israelites is just not biblically supported. For example, God takes the Israelites into the land and he drives the nations out. But what does he tell them? If you commit these sins, guess what's going to happen to you? The same thing I did to them. And guess what happened to them? The same thing. They were exiled. They were deported. Okay? This, in fact, is not how Moses understood God's relationship with Israel. After the golden calf incident, God says, you know what? You people are stiff-necked. You people are rebellious. I'm not going with you. I'm going to send my angel. And Moses says, God, please, you have to reconsider. Why? He says that your presence, Moses to God says, your presence is the only thing that distinguishes us from other nations. It's not that the Israelites were more numerous or superior or just better, and so that's why God chose them. No, God chose them because it was his good pleasure, and actually God chose them, as we see in Genesis, to be a blessing to all of the nations. And we have that fulfillment in Christ. Any questions, guys? I think we can leave it there for today. Maybe I'll just give this, guys, to you, and we'll cut it out of the video. But putting, I guess, my pastoral cap on. I think this has a lot of relevance for us today. And I'll just go quickly because I know we've covered a lot. The first thing is, I think when we read the Levitical laws, you can keep it just in case. When we read the Levitical laws, it should invoke gratitude, okay? The fact that we don't have to do a million things to access God's presence like these people did, and that we can all access God's presence directly, should just be a motive for gratitude. Not only that, but that we can approach God with confidence, as Hebrews says, because Jesus is once and for all sacrifice. We don't have to be like them, going back and back again, because obviously animal sacrifices were not enough to cleanse us. There is no holiness gap, in a sense, between us and God anymore, because Jesus covers that gap. The other thing that I want you guys to really interiorize is that I think Leviticus teaches us obedience to God even when we don't fully understand. I mean, I said this earlier, but I think if we're being 100% honest, we might not have all the reasons behind the prohibitions. But one thing we do know, regardless of the reasons, those laws did represent God's standards for the Israelites. In our Christian lives, guys, there are going to be times when we don't fully understand, and we are going to have to obey. There's this interesting concept in Scripture, and you can see it through several verses, where God says, obey me, and then afterwards, understanding follows. That's a biblical principle. You obey God even when you don't understand, and God follows through by blessing you with understanding. I hate to give a personal example, but that's what happened to me with law school. I was not completely sure whatsoever, but I obeyed, and then in the weeks after, God confirmed that it was the right decision. Andrew Clavin says, so it is with every action we take, from marriage to having a child, to choosing a profession, to surrendering your will to God. At every step, we bet all we have on what we cannot know for sure. Faith is not an act of unreason. It is a commitment to the self-evident truth that the spiritual reality that we see through a glass darkly is really there. Knowing that, we may travel toward it step by humble, uncertain step. Okay? And I think the last thing worth mentioning is our understanding of holiness, to restructure it, not so much as viewing holiness as a list of do's and don'ts, like what my brother was mentioning today in the sermon. Not a mere abstaining from evil. Holiness is something that we have to actively pursue in all areas of our lives. Isn't it fascinating how even what they wore, even what they ate, could point to God? And I think the same thing applies in our lives. Okay? That's all I have for today. Thank you, guys.